Good evening, everyone. We welcome you all to today's discussion organized by the Economics faculty at School of Liberal Studies at Ambedkar University, Delhi. We are pleased to be joined by Dr. Chinmay Tumbe, and he would be speaking on the topic migration and pandemics. Before we begin, I request the attendees to keep their audio and video turned off while the session is in progress. Kindly leave your questions in the Q&A box and we can take them up once the talk is over. I'll request Dr. Parag Vaknis, Associate Professor of Economics at AUD, to introduce the speaker and begin today's session.
All right. Thank you, Aishwarya. Welcome everybody again. Welcome, Dr. Tumbe. Dr. Chinmay Tumbe is an assistant professor at Indian Institute of Management, Ahmedabad. He specializes in urban and labor economics, business and economic history, and migration studies. Most of you must be aware of his book on the subject titled India Moving, A History of Migration, which was, I think, published in 2018. And he recently published another book titled The Age of Pandemics, which was published by HarperCollins. So I think along with several academic articles on migration, he has thought about these topics in quite a lot of detail. Since the extent of internal migration in India became much more visible, abundantly visible during the early onset of COVID. And simultaneously, it also exposed the complete lack of understanding of its nature and quantum in eventual policy response to the pandemic. I think it might be a good idea to kind of inform our discourse on the topic by some researched perspectives. And that's why we invited Dr. Tumbe here. So without any further delay, I invite him to present his thoughts on the subject. And as Aishwarya said, we will take your questions towards the end. You can also put in your, actually you should put in your questions in the Q&A. Thank you, Dr. Chinmay Tumbe. Over to you.
Thanks a lot, Dr. Parag. It's a great pleasure to be here. I wish I could be there, in person, hopefully after this pandemic is over. I've actually never visited Ambedkar University and I've always wanted to. So this is a wonderful opportunity for me. Today, I'm going to speak about migration and pandemics. As it happens, I've written a book each on each of these subjects. And so what I'm going to do in this talk is try and map out a little bit about migration. What do we really know about migration in India? I'm going to talk a little bit about that. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about pandemics. But above all, what I want to talk about is the intersection between these two topics. And as Parag pointed out, last year, this was in, between March 2020 and May 2020, all that we saw was this massive exodus from our cities of migrants walking back home. And that, I think, probably for the first time, even the layperson who had never thought about migration suddenly started thinking about migration. And of course, a lot of those events were completely foreseeable for pretty much everyone who's been studying migration in India. And that is why I think what I'm going to try and do today is to convey some of what the research on migration is showing, and especially about what we learn from this whole episode, strange episodes called pandemics and migration. So how do we deal with migration and pandemics? So that's what I'm going to be talking about. Right. So this is, the context, right? That is, last year, we saw the shocking visuals of migrant workers walking back home. And this is pandemic coronavirus and the migration crisis in India. And often, you kind of use these words like unprecedented exodus, which you often saw last year. But one of the things I do apart from economics is history. And when this whole episode was rolling out, actually, it was very obvious for some of us who work on economic history in particular that this would have happened in any case, right? And so I'm going to start by showing you a photograph from 1897, which is on the left side of the screen, right? And what is this image telling you? It's a very similar image to the one on the right. Note that, they are separated by 123 years, but it's the same kind of anguish, same kind of desperation to go back home written on the faces of both these migrant workers, one in 2020 and one in 1897, right? And both of them under pandemic context. One in the case of coronavirus, 1897 was this famous plague pandemic which struck Bombay, right? The difference, of course, is that the railways were on during the plague, and so people are entering the railways, whereas out here, people are walking back home, right? So that's the big difference. Now, I'll come back to this at the end of the presentation as to how we should be looking at pandemic management, especially with respect to the vast numbers that we have on migration in India. But this is just to start off this discussion that pandemics are particular episodes which spark off reverse migration. This is not unique to India. This is not unique to this pandemic. It has always happened. Whenever there's been a pandemic, there's been a general urge for people to try and go back, right? So that is a psychological fear of people. But that psychological fear is predicated on various other things, especially of what it means to be a migrant worker working in India, whether in 1897 or today. And here I'm going to argue that actually some of the broad patterns of migration, believe it or not, are virtually unchanged in this grand 120-year period. So that's a larger story which I'm going to talk about. It's this idea of migration persistence. That is what you saw happening last year is pretty much, in terms of the migration phenomenon, pretty much been around in India for more than a century. Okay. The other reason why, especially students and faculty of economics should engage, I think, more with pandemics is this basic idea of growth and inflation rate. This is the two most famous macroeconomic variables, and each point on this chart is a data point for the particular year. So for example, if you look at 1942, this is during World War II, where inflation rates were very high, right, and growth was limited. And you'll see that the worst year in Indian economic history from 1900 to now, let's say 2019, is the year 1980. Right? And what happened in 1980? It was the great influenza pandemic. So the worst year in Indian history was actually not the Great Depression, but the influenza year of 1980. And I'm starting off again by showing this chart because economic students in India, I think, especially need to be aware of how serious the costs of pandemics are. And again, I point out how it's connected with migration. It's interesting that 2020 is likely to end up here, which means minus 10% growth, most projections minus 8 to minus 10, and inflation rates close to about 8 to 10% or 7 to 8%. So inflation rate's not as high as 1918, which had a massive supply side shock, but fairly high enough, which means really the worst 2 years in recorded Indian economic history, pretty much because of pandemics. Right? So there are massive economic fallouts which happen through pandemics. And we're going to try and understand why exactly this hits migrant workers in particular tremendously. So to start this discussion with a bit of history. I'm going to show you some maps on where people are migrating to, why they're migrating, and so on. But it's often useful to start off with some history. So this is a chart from the late 19th century in the Illustrated London News, and it says modes of traveling in India. Right. And of course, important because we saw, what happened when the railway shut down last year was people started walking. And so to move, you need, of course, a means of transport. You either walk or you take some, a transport vehicle. And so what this image shows you, of course, is kind of a celebration of the Indian railways. So there are all these other ways of traveling in India. It's called trams, Hindu pilgrim, traveling beggar, dak, ekka, riding elephant, billy, different methods. And then there's this grand arrival of the railways. Right? Now, why are we talking about this? It's because when the railways is introduced in India in the late 19th century, it fundamentally transforms the idea of space. Right? So for about 2,000 odd years before the introduction of the railways in the Indian subcontinent, the fastest way of getting from point A to point B was the speed of the horse. Right? Or if you got a downstream current on a river, you could go fairly fast. But what the railways does is fundamentally alter the notion of speed, the notion of time, the notion of space. Right? And so one of the consequences of this is that it really gives a big boost to internal migration. Right? And consequently, of course, steam power also shrinks the globe. You have mass migration around the world. And so millions of Indians actually leave India and go overseas, the Caribbean, to Africa, to Southeast Asia. So this is in a way an age of mass migration, okay, facilitated by steamboats on the oceans and the railways inland. But what's interesting is, of course, where these people started going from, right? Because I'm arguing that the districts of India, which started sending out these migrant workers in the late 19th century, are pretty much the same districts from which people were going out in 2019 or 2020, and pretty much the same districts in which people were going back to when the coronavirus pandemic struck. And so there's this great continuity over about 120. And if you don't believe me, you can just look at some numbers like this, right? One of the great things about Indian migration is, for work in particular, is just how male dominated it is in terms of the nature of the work, right? So this is, something one needs to be aware of. This is a chart of sex ratios. All of you have heard of sex ratios. You've probably heard these are female to male sex ratios. And Amartya Sen had famously coined this phenomenon called the missing women, right? And so he had pointed out that in states like Haryana, Punjab, you sometimes have sex ratios of 700 or 800 females to 1,000. But a lot of my research has been to point out the converse, that is the phenomenon of the missing men, not the missing women, but the missing men, right? And so where are these men? Who are these missing men? They're basically missing in their source regions, and they're found in the destination regions, which are typically cities. So take two classic districts of India, Ratnagiri and Udupi, right? Both very famous for mass out-migration, mostly to Bombay, but Udupi people, all over India, pretty much. All of you, I'm sure, have eaten in some Udupi restaurant, and a huge part of that migration was in the restaurant sector, right? And so what this chart shows you is that from 1901 to 2011, right, 110 years, the sex ratio of these two districts has never really been below 1,100 females to 1,000 males, right? So this is the story of the missing men. And why missing men? Because they're outside, right? And conversely, because these guys are going out, right, the sex ratio of the places they're going to is highly depressed. So some of our famous cities like Mumbai, Kolkata, they started off actually in the early 20th century as pretty much as being male ghettos, which means mostly men were living in these cities. Sex ratios of some of these cities were something like 500 or 600 females to 1,000. It's the flip, it's the converse of districts that you're seeing out here. Now, there are a couple of points to make of these two districts. Ratnagiri and Udupi, this particular migration wave had certain characteristics. One, as it's obvious from this chart, it was highly male dominated in nature. Two, it was semi-permanent, precisely because only the men moved. Typically, they would have to return at some point because their wives and family were back home. And so this is not really permanent settlement-based migration. This is what we would call a semi-permanent migration. And three, the money these guys would make in the destination would be sent back home, right? So this is a whole remittance economy which is built around this. Now, here's the map corresponding to today's data of India's out-migration. Again, I'm going to talk a little bit about this map because it's a map which kind of conveys very nicely both the history and geography of migration in India. Okay. So I want to start with the two districts I just mentioned, that is Ratnagiri, which is actually based here, if you see my mouse, and if you see Udupi, which is based out here, right? And both these districts are shaded in red. What does red color on this map mean? It means more than 25% of households has somebody in that district who has gone out in search of work, which means if you walk in an average village in these districts, 1 in 4 houses has somebody out for work. Okay, and this is mass migration, however you want to define it. Okay, now this is data from the National Sample Survey, 2007-8. Be happy to take questions later on, the validity of these estimates and so on. But this map kind of, has a very interesting shape. Right? You'll see that all along India's west coast, including Kerala. Kerala, people go to the Gulf, so that's international migration, not internal migration. Then even coastal Tamil Nadu. Coastal Orissa has a huge out-migration wave, mainly to Gujarat. And then you have the world's arguably biggest labor catchment reserve, which is Eastern UP and Bihar. No, not Western UP, just Eastern UP and Bihar. Right? And then you have the sort of Himalayan region. If you count Nepal, it's Nepal plus Himachal plus Uttarakhand. And then you have a large parts of Rajasthan. Then you also have, parts of Gujarat and so on. Now, these red shaded districts, I argue in my book called India Moving, belong to something called the Great Indian Migration. right? Which means that these red districts that you're seeing have been sending out migrant workers, not for one, not for two, not for three generations, but literally many, many generations spanning more than 100 years, right? Earlier, the destinations have changed over time. So from this, for example, V.S. Naipaul, his ancestry in the Caribbean can be traced to Gorakhpur, which is in eastern UP. Right? So many people, for example, if you look at the West Indies cricket team, many of the cricketers, Indian ethnic, they trace their origins out here. Similarly in Southeast Asia and so on. But over time, their destinations have changed. Right? So earlier, many of them were recruited by the British to work on overseas plantations. They were recruited to work in Calcutta. They were recruited to work for Bombay. But over time, what happened was that those particular districts developed a specialization in migration. What does that mean? It means if you grow up in these districts, especially as a man, irrespective of caste, by the way, you kind of grow in a culture of migration where you see everybody around you migrating, you also feel like migrating. Whereas if you grow up in Madhya Pradesh, in the middle of Madhya Pradesh, which is not well known for out migration, you don't see others going out for work, and hence you don't end up going out and joining others for work, because simply put, these districts have the information necessary to migrate and these districts don't. Okay. So the first question to ask is, of course, what explains this map? And you might be tempted to say that, it's poverty. Don't we know that Bihar is one of the poorest parts of India, and that's why it's poverty driving migration? Isn't it the case that the visuals that we saw last year was the poor of India being driven out? Right? And the first thing to say is that actually that's not the case. Okay, so the fundamental reason why we see this map is population density. Okay, that is why actually India's poorest part, which is Bihar, and one of India's richest parts, which is Kerala, by the way, have the same rates of outmigration. Yeah, let that soak in, because you all study economics. You would think that if Bihar is going to take many decades to catch up with Kerala, there is no guarantee that its outmigration will stop. Why? Because we know what's the number for Kerala. Kerala's number is as high as Bihar. But the Keralites, of course, are going to the Gulf. The Biharis are going even to the Gulf, but pretty much all over India as well. So population density on arable land is very high in the Gangetic Plains and the lower Gangetic Plains, as well as on the west coast. And so density is probably the easiest explanatory variable to understand this map. And note, as I said, density on arable land. So even Rajasthan, you might think density is low, but when you look at density on arable land, so not the desert land, but the arable land, it turns out to be not quite low. Okay, so density is much lower here. The other reason is, of course, history, right? And so these parts that you're seeing in red shade were basically the recruitment centers for the British, often in many of the plantations, many of the industries. So think of the jute industry in Calcutta, the cotton textile industry in Mumbai, and a lot of these districts that you're seeing on this map. So the Ratnagiri, for example, was completely connected with the textile industry of, right? So you'll note that even in places like Gujarat, right, you have districts like Ambreli, you have districts like Porbandar and so on, which are sending out thousands and thousands of migrants to places like Surat, places like Mumbai for work. Now, this is one kind of migration, the red shaded districts. I'm also showing 4 circles on this map, right? And those circles also have outmigration, but of a very different kind. Right? So they are short term, we call them seasonal migration for literally a few months of the year. Okay, again, mostly male dominated, but here these migrations are disproportionately drawn from the scheduled castes, from the scheduled tribes. It is these kind of migrations from these clusters out here which are the most exploited migrants of India, right? So they are working in jobs like brick kiln work, in rural farm harvesting operations, the worst kind of jobs possible, right? Whereas these other districts that you're seeing, actually, when you look at the data, the migrations out here actually increase over incomes. That is, the richer you are, the more likely you are to migrate. Why is that? Because these migrations are relatively more long term. And in order to live in the city for even 10 months, you need some starting capital. So here's the thing, if you have no money, if you're landless, you actually can't live in the city for too long, right? You can live on the city only for a few weeks. And that is why you get even more seasonal kind of migrations. Whereas if you have some capital, if you have social capital, which means you have a caste network, your friends, your fathers, your uncles are already in the city, you know of that information, you're much more likely to move out. Right, so 2 different kinds of migration, the semi-permanent, which is long-term circular, and short-term, which is seasonal circular. Now, cumulatively, Both of this we call as circular migration. And what we're saying is that India has over 100 million circular migrants, who go for work. Okay, now that's a large number. That's almost a quarter of our workforce or more. In leading cities, it's more than a third. Sometimes in Surat, more than half of the workforce is circular migrant. Right? Now you might think, is this unique to India? Doesn't China have it? Well, China also has a part of it, but China's migration is much more gender balanced, which means that the women are also moving. Whereas what we're seeing in India is in this great transformation story of people moving from farms to cities, it's mostly the men who are moving. Okay. Women are, of course, moving, but not directly for work. Typically, it is for marriage. So if you look at the census data, the largest number of migrants are women, right? But that is typically village to village kind of migration. But if you look at long distance circular migration for work, men outnumber women by a huge order of magnitude. As a result, the red shaded districts of India also receive a lot of money. So these are also India's remittance economies. And this is going to matter in a bit when we talk about pandemics. How does this square with urbanization? This right-hand side chart is the same chart I just showed you, which is out-migration clusters. You look at urbanization, one thing you realize is that India lacks a big city in this circle out here, right? So a lot of these people out here are moving to centers like Delhi, Mumbai, Bangalore, now Chennai, Hyderabad, and Pune, and so on. But there's no big dynamic city in this block out here, which is able to contain a lot of that migration. So that is why a lot of this migration happens from this part, to other parts of the world, of India and the world. Just to have a quick run through some of these, leading cities. Think of Mumbai. This is a heat map of Mumbai. Mumbai draws its migrants from virtually all parts of India. But note, more people go to Mumbai from Eastern UP than Madhya Pradesh, right? And that is why in India, if you want to understand migration, you have to understand this word called networks. The most important thing in migration is social networks, right? That is, you can move to a new place by two types. You can either go through a contractor. That happens in the short term, really poor, exploited kind of migrations. But the bulk of India's urban informal workforce comes from what we would call as, through social networks. So these guys are not coming from contractors, they're coming through family, caste networks. Right? So this is a good map to tell you that it is not just distance. In economics, we have something called as a gravity model, right? Which explains that trade or labor flows, it matters how large those places are and how the shorter the distance, the more flows you'll get. But you'll see with migration, sometimes distance is not the only thing. You would think if distance was mattered, you'd find more people from Madhya Pradesh going to Bombay or Mumbai than UP. But that's not the case. Why? Because the UP guys established a network more than 100 years back and over time have built onto those networks. Now, why does this matter in the context of pandemics? It's because this map very quickly tells you when a pandemic strikes, where the people are going to go back. Right? And so it's not a surprise when the Shramik train started in May, most of those trains were taking people from cities like Mumbai and so on to pretty much the red shaded districts that you're seeing. Okay? Now, this data is kind of dated. It's from the 1990s. Obviously, much has changed since then, but the broad contours, I would argue, have not changed dramatically. This is Delhi, which gets most of its migrants from the Gangetic Plains. This is Kolkata, which gets most of its migrants from a very small catchment area. The West Bengal today has now become more of an out migration place. So more people are moving out from West Bengal. And during the pandemic last, a lot of people had to go back to West Bengal because of that. And Surat is interesting because Surat is one of India's fastest growing cities, and it draws migrants from all over India, but especially coastal Orissa. Right? And there's one district out here called Ganjam, which sends out a lot of people to Surat. And if you saw a New York Times article on migration and pandemics, what happened last year, you'll realize that one of the districts affected by coronavirus was Ganjam. Right? Why? Because these migrants came back and effective quarantines did not take place. Okay, so just to summarize, how do we look at migration in India? One category is duration. And this is my favorite category because I think you can understand a lot of migration in India by just understanding whether it's seasonal, semi-permanent, or permanent. Right? And seasonal and semi-permanent together make it circular. Now, permanent is basically, guys, we're not saying people who live forever there, but people who live there for long time periods without actually necessarily going back to a native place. Right? So that is what we really mean by permanent. And in India, the dominant form of migration is semi-permanent, okay, which is part of circular. This is again distinctive from the Chinese model. It's distinctive from many other countries. What this means is that most migrant workers in India have 1 foot in the village and 1 foot in the city. And the question to ask is, of course, why? Why is it so circular? So we're going to talk a little bit about that. We'll talk in a bit about reasons. But like everything in India, there is selection which happens across gender. So I discussed that. More men are going. There's selection across castes, the selection across religion, and the selection across region. So I showed you region in terms of the geography. I can talk about caste and religion in the Q&A if you want to. Now, the question of why is migration in India so male-dominated and circular? Two explanations, two standard explanations. One is there are norms in the source region which actually prevent women from moving. Right? So if you actually ask the average Bihari migrant worker who's in a city, why have you come here alone? And why is your wife not here with you? They will typically say that this is not our culture. Right? This is not part of our tradition. Why? Because the woman is expected to look after the land and in-laws back home. And the expectation is of this male breadwinner to earn and send back money. Now, of course, there are outliers to this story. From Chhattisgarh, you have a lot of single female migration, but that's still the minority. It's growing, but it's still the minority. So the biggest migration is a single male migration, which is happening in India. The other part of the story is the destination region. So, for example, we say that a lot of our Indian cities are fairly hostile to migrants, which means it's very difficult to have or make a foothold in our cities. Either it's too expensive, land is very expensive, housing is very expensive. And so the objective function, so to speak, of the migrant worker is to save and remit and retire back home rather than to invest in the city. Okay, and you can see this in a variety of different settings. I mentioned Ratnagiri. We did a lot of studies on Ratnagiri, and there's a phrase in Marathi, "Jechi kholi techi Mumbai," which means basically whoever owns or has space in Mumbai, whoever owns a house, a kholi as we call it, basically has a foothold in Mumbai. Otherwise, we go back to the Konkan. Right? So this is a particular sort of, and you'll see how these culture, a lot of these tropes on migration are very well enmeshed with local folk songs, local cultures, this idea of circularity. So there's circularity because of source region norms on gender, on why women cannot move, because the woman also moves and the family can settle down. But because the woman is not moving, there's this estranged family which occurs. The other reason is, of course, in the destination, sometimes you just can't settle down. Now, one aspect of that is in India, that we find it very difficult to settle down in many cities, but also in the Gulf, for example, when our migrants go to Gulf, you don't get citizenship. Right? So you can also have official policies blocking entry on a more permanent basis. So when the visa expires in the Gulf, you basically just have to come back. So even if you want to settle down in the Gulf, you can't do that. Okay, so why do people migrate? A lot of reasons. The classic economic reasons is wage differentials. You might have heard of something called as the Harris-Todaro model. It's the most famous model in economics on migration. It means that people will move from low productivity areas to high productivity areas. And then over time, there'll be an equilibrating mechanism. So the low productivity areas will come up because people have gone and wages out there will rise. And because people have come into cities, they will keep the wages there low. And so over time, the wage differentials will converge. Is this happening in India? Not much of an evidence. It happened in China, huge wage convergence from the poor to rich regions. In India, we're not finding. And again, why? Because this migration is circular. People in India defy the classic, what you'd call as an Arthur Lewis story of, surplus labor moving to cities, because the surplus labor moves to cities and never actually permanently settles there. They are also going back. So there's no real release of this so-called surplus labor from agriculture in India because of this continuous circularity of migration. But people migrate even beyond for economic reasons. Ambedkar most famously himself said that people should migrate. He most famously argued that urban spheres are less restrictive on caste. The anonymity provides great benefits, and there are a lot of studies which document this. I write a lot about this in my book. For example, Dalit entrepreneurs point out that migration is often the best way to set up an enterprise, because to be an entrepreneur you have to fail multiple times. It's not easy to just one fine day succeed in business. But that failure is often looked down upon by your brethren in the source region. And if you move to a new place, that anonymity greatly helps. So a lot of the literature on Dalit entrepreneurship, for example, points out to how migration can be very liberating. Then you have peer pressure, social networks. Education is a huge reason why people are migrating. I think a lot of the students can relate to this. And then transfers if you're in the bureaucracy. And of course, marriage, which is actually the single most important reason. So in India, we say there are over 300 million women migrants, pretty much for this marriage reason, right? Because virtually every adult woman in India is a migrant. Another way to see this is, of course, that people are being pushed out from the source region. Now, any migration decision is actually a combination of both what we call as pull factors and push factors. Right? But often people kind of stress the pull or stress the push. But the way I see it, it's always a combination of both these things. Now, what happens in the pandemic, of course, is that the classic rural to urban migration reverses. People want to leave actually cities and go back to villages, right? So it's a completely different kind of system that happens out there. Okay, this is just to tell you about how people are migrating in India. Are people in India responding to income differentials? The evidence is very clear. The x-axis is income per capita. Delhi, Goa, very rich states, they're on this side of the x-axis. The y-axis is basically a measure of migration. This is from a work in the economic survey, and you'll see that higher the per capita incomes, more the in-migration. Right? So the richer you are as a state, with the exception of Kerala, which has a lot of out-migration to the Gulf and so on, the richer you are, the more likely you are going to get migrants. Right? But as I said, density is the most important. And so Bihar and UP, for example, have massive out-migration. So people in India are responding to income differentials across states. Now, having set the foundation for migration, what have we discussed on migration? We've said that the fundamental form of work-related migration in India is circular, it is male-dominated, and it is highly persistent, which means these migrations that you're seeing, I have not just started because of 1991 liberalization or something like that. I have dated most of these migrations to at least the late 19th century. So we're talking for the world's largest voluntary and persistent migration streams in human history, what I've been calling as the Great Indian Migration period. But interestingly, that particular period, late 19th century, was also a period of mass epidemic-related mortality. And three pandemics in particular, cholera, plague, and influenza, ravaged the Indian subcontinent. And you'll see the death rates of India, they start climbing from 1875 to about 1908, which is a year of a high malaria outbreak. And then this one-time massive spike, which was the influenza pandemic of 1918. And then from 1920 onwards, India's death rate starts to fall. Right? And it's been falling ever since. So this was this unusual period in Indian history, which also coincided with the birth of mass male-dominated migration streams. And so some of these years are very famous. 1878 and 1900 are because of the great famines. Famines meant cholera-related deaths. So the cholera was acting on a lot of those undernourished bodies. But 1897 was also a plague year. So this period between 1897 and 1920 was very high plague-related mortality. It's called the plague pandemic. So you had three pandemics working in tandem, pretty much. Cholera kind of subsided, plague persisted, and influenza was like a one-year massive spike in mortality. Now, the question is, if you want to curtail a pandemic, or what happened back then? After 1920, India really did not have a pandemic, or at least a major pandemic, until coronavirus came in 2020. Right? And so that's why many people said, oh, it's unprecedented and so on. But as a person who works on history, this is clearly not new. And so, these three pandemics did leave an imprint. And when you look at the history of them, it's very interesting about how it affected migration. And I think there's a lot of learning from those periods about how we look at migration and pandemics today. Okay, so let me start with this plague episode, right? And 1897, as I said, was 1896, 97, it really hits Bombay. Now, what did the British government do in order to curtail plague? Now, the British government actually failed miserably on a variety of fronts. They had extremely harsh surveillance measures. They imposed this Epidemic Diseases Act of 1897, which, by the way, is the same law under which we are working, last year to contain the corona pandemic. So it has a clear continuity even in legislation. What the plague introduced in India was used last year. But most famously in the case of migration, the British had to make a choice of shutting down the Indian railways or not. Right? And it's very instructive of what they eventually did. The British reasoned that if they shut down the Indian railways, migrant workers will simply walk back home. Right? And so they actually have this entire deliberation of whether to go for a strict lockdown or not. And the reasoning was very simple, that they realized that migration in India was very circular in nature. People live, both these lives in villages and cities. And if they actually shut down the railways, because the panic had in a way already set in, migrant workers would still want to go back home, right? And then it would make matters worse if they were actually walking, because many would die walking, and they would actually spread the disease in even more distant corners as they went. So what the British did was actually set up special trains to send back the migrant workers. Right? And did these migrant workers eventually come back? Of course they did. Just like this year, after going back, all those migrant workers, most of them have come back. Right? So what happened? So the British set up these special trains, and half of Bombay's population left. So out of a population of about 800,000 people, 400,000 people in the city of Bombay left. Okay, and they went back. And then later on in the year, they came back. It's as simple. Okay, and that particular year was actually not that bad for plague. Plague actually tore apart in India in the from 1900s onwards. So in fact, the British at the end of this year were patting themselves on the back, though it was a sort of a bad thing to very prematurely celebrate the end of the pandemic, because the pandemic actually lasted for something like 20 years. Now, in the event, it kind of saved, of course, a lot of people from this ignominy of walking back. We have another case in history of pandemics and migration. And this is about the plague in China in 1911. Plague, tore through many parts of the world, not just India, but also China. This was a particular kind of plague called the pneumonic plague, which was very, very virulent. And what did the Chinese authorities in 1911 do? They shut down the railways for migrant workers. So third class and fourth class, so-called third class and fourth class passengers were not allowed to take the train. What happened? People walked back home. And because this was in January 1911, which is peak winter, basically people died in large numbers walking back home in China. So this precedent of a pandemic and what do we do with migrant workers was actually there for us, in March 2020. We had two clear incidents. One in India of sending back migrant workers beforehand, and two in China of shutting down the railways and seeing a massive humanitarian crisis unfold. Right? So both of these things have actually happened before. Right? But of course, the decision we took in 2020 was to go for the strictest lockdown possible, of course, with a very benevolent objective to curtail the spread of the virus. So the argument could be made that if the railways was open, then the virus would have spread across India and would have a much higher mortality. In the event, what the government actually did was only delay the lockdown. You'll see that the government of India did open the railways for the migrant workers, the Shramik trains, 2 months later, right? So the argument was that, we will rear up our health facilities in the local rural centers, and so we can send back these migrant workers later. Now, as it turned out, the infection rates in the general population were much higher, of course, in the month of May than in the month of March. And so in some of these migration corridors, what you saw was the virus sort of spread through precisely densely congested trains and so on. Luckily for us, it didn't spiral out of control. Right? So we know some districts got affected, districts like Ganjam and coastal Odisha, but overall, it was managed reasonably well. But in that interim period, what we had was a full-blown disaster. Right? And we got, by the government's own record, more than 20,000 refugee camps. My estimates suggest that about 30 million people moved back, both by trains, about I think 5 to 10 million by trains, others by buses and various other means, and definitely millions also on foot walking back, especially intrastate. Right? And so it tells you that, so this question of, why did so many people go back? This is at the heart of this whole topic of migration and pandemics. That is, why do people want to go back? And the best way of, explaining this is to give you a personal example. I was stuck in this, great flood of Mumbai in more than 15 years back, and I had to walk 3 kilometers home, so not much, but I was stuck, in the city in the middle of the road, and we had two options: either we stay where we were with the flood waters rising, or we had to make a decision of walking back home with all the attendant risks and getting, to some other kind of safety. And not surprisingly, the choice most of us made at that point was to walk. Why? Because simply put, we did not know how much further these floodwaters would rise if we were, staying out there. The key thing is the credibility of staying there alive, right? And this is precisely the choice people had to make, to stay or to go back, right? And in most cases, the staying power was very, very weak. Why? Because a lot of these workers are daily wage workers. Even if not daily wage, the salaries basically stopped. And the completely precarious nature of work in these, circular migration kind of roles meant that a lot of people did not simply have the livelihoods or the support until the government stepped in later to survive even a few weeks in our cities. Right? And so the choice was very rational. The choice was to go back because in your villages, you will at least survive something. In the city, it was getting more and more difficult. It was also a problem of consistency of the timeline. In monetary policy, you learn something called as time inconsistency of policies. The lockdown when it was announced last year was for 21 days, but it kept getting extended, right? And so that really intensified the crisis because no longer was the deadline credible, and that pushed out a lot of migrant workers back home. The other thing which was heard both in 1897 and 2020 was a psychological dilemma, right? And it's been recorded in 1897 as well as last year. This particular phrase, "Ki marna hai to gaon mein marenge," which basically means, if we anyway have to die, we'll rather go back home and die. So there's also this cultural aspect of death in its own right. That is, most people would like to ideally, scatter their ashes in their native place, right? In this case, most people meaning male migrant workers. So a variety of reasons, psychological, economic imperatives, which was very, very obvious to a lot of us who worked on migration. And that is why we all wrote op-ed pieces, between March 24th and 26th, 2 days after the lockdown, or within those days. All of us pointed out that this is simply not sustainable. And at some point, the migrant workers will have to be sent back home with some dignity. Unfortunately, it happened 2 months later. And then what we had in the process was this major crisis. Right. So how do we see migration and pandemics then? Okay, so first is India has this issue of circular migration, and it's not going to change in the next few years. This is a reality we have to deal with, right? And we also know that every pandemic requires some migration, which means how does a pandemic happen? It happens only when some people have moved with this particular, or there's some sort of vector movement of these diseases. So obviously, to curtail a pandemic, one needs to curtail migration. That's a no-brainer. But as it turns out, it's much easier to do that for international migration than internal migration. So for example, shutting down flights from UK and so on. But you can't do that with internal migration. Why? For the simple reason that people can always walk, right? It is almost impossible to physically enforce a complete shutdown or lockdown of transport options because people in India will choose to walk. And that sort of imposes, again, it's easier to enforce an international lockdown, but it's very difficult to enforce an internal lockdown. And so this burning question, how should internal migration be curtailed, especially at the onset of a pandemic? And so what these experiences suggest that is in India, in the future, the only thing to do is to give migrants the right to actually go back at the onset of a pandemic, right? Which means that in March 2020, the government of India should have given migrants the option to go back home, keep the trains running for 1 week, and then shut it down, if at all. The other option, of course, is to create a policy architecture, which means that migrants will not suffer in our cities if their income streams shut down for a few weeks, right? And so that means looking at 3 core aspects. So one of the reasons why migration is very circular in India, or migration is very precarious, is that social security, we say in India, is not at all portable, right? And so that's why we have this whole call for one nation, one ration card scheme now. And hopefully that will alleviate some of these issues. But still, this is one of India's biggest problems when it comes to migrant work. The other is that a lot of migrants left simply because their landlords and landladies evicted them, right? So we have a really bad rental housing space. One is there's very little rental housing, affordable rental housing. And 2, that these contracts are not really formal, right? So they're very informal. There's a whole sort of land mafia involved with that. And migrant workers got caught out because of that. The third reason why migrants were so frustrated in 2020 was that the contractors especially the construction sector, deserted them, right? And so how do we get more contractor accountability is an important part of this story. So that in the future, if we want to keep migrants in a particular place and not allow them to go back in this hope of containing a pandemic, all these 3 things have to be set. right? And unfortunately, while some discussion has started on these two aspects, there's a long way to go. And so if some of your economics students, these are very burning public policy questions which matter, especially when we talk of migration, and especially in the connection of migration. So this is what this talk was about. It was about migration and pandemics. This idea that it was unprecedented, you should throw out of the window. We've had episodes like this in the past, and there's some value in learning from different episodes. But the key takeaway is this highly circular nature of migration in India, which confounds many standard economic theories, like your Arthur Lewis's transformation from surplus labor to places of less surplus labor. Because in India, we're saying it's circular. So these surplus labor regions are never really going to become less dense, so to speak. It confounds many of these classic Harris-Todaro kind of theories, because a lot of these workers work in the informal sector, not in the formal sector. Right? And so you have different issues out there. So Indian migration is also interesting to study for economists, because it kind of provides different alternatives to standard theories in economics on what's happening with migration. So I'll end here. I have two books. Please read them. One is on migration, one is on pandemics. I also have a Twitter handle and Instagram handle called @BizEconHist, which tracks my course on business and economic history. So if any of you are interested in business and economic history, that's something you should know. And I do run a internship program for people interested in business and economic history. It's usually pitched at the MA and PhD level. So if you're interested in that, feel free to write, and all the details are available online. So with that, I'll stop and be happy to take questions.
Thank you, Dr. Tumbe. That was a very interesting and informative lecture. So let's see if there are any questions. There is only, so people can actually raise hand, and then we will unmute you, and then you can ask your question, or you can have your questions in Q&A. So both things are possible. So I'll allow time for people to raise their hands. Meanwhile, I can read out one question from the Q&A. So the first question basically says, the COVID lockdown, which had led to reverse migration, initially has now a potential to contribute into more circulatory migration scenario, which has been observed in India over the NSSO data as well. What is your take for the coming times and its implications?
Yeah, I mean, it's tough to say whether the lockdown will lead to more or less circular migration. I think, as I said, the reason why migration is, let's look at it this way. Will migration stop because of all these things that happened in the last year? Definitely not. So I look at migration as being inevitable. So this flow from rural areas to urban areas is inevitable in India. And from all the data we have, the numbers are rising as a percentage. The 2001 to 11 census, 2001 to 2011 census shows a massive increase in migration. Next year, this year is the next census, but there could be some data issues which lead to maybe not a sharp uptick in migration. But my sense is still that this last decade also saw different changes in migration. Is migration in India becoming less circular or more circular? I think fundamentally you will get that answer only when women's migration for work in India starts increasing. Right? So that's the only time when we can say that circularity is on the decline. Now, there is absolutely clear data that women's migration for work is increasing, but the numbers are still very low when you look at what's happening with men. Right? So it's only, I think, in a couple of decades down the line that India's migration is likely to become more permanent, more from being very circular. And the obvious implication of that is on an urbanization rate. So one of the reasons why India's urbanization rate is so slow, that it's going up so slowly from census to census, is because actually people are not only coming to our cities, but they're also going back. I mean, you should see our cities as young migrants coming in, replacing older cohorts who are going back. It's not this one-way street where people are just coming and settling into our cities. You should see it in terms of age cohorts. And the huge age cohorts, 50 plus, who are going back. That is why, compared to China, our urbanization process is really, really slow. Right? And so that is why I think circularity in India will eventually shift only when women start moving in larger numbers. Now that's happening for education. Hopefully that will also start happening for work and so on. And I think only that. But I think it's a very long-term question. So your question, specific question, what is it for the coming times and its implications, is that in the immediate short term, I don't see any impact. But in the long term, I'm hopeful that more women join the workforce in cities, because this is the classic transformation story which happened in China, which was very, very good, I would say, in terms of its impact on poverty and so on. So that is what we want. We want, there's also another view saying, should we have less migration? And I don't take that view. I think we need more migration. We need more people to move from farm to non-farm sector and so on.
Okay. As people think and decide their questions, let me ask one question from my side. I may have missed if you had presented this, but so in terms of the destination regions, right? So what are the kind of business activities that these migrants tend to go to? I mean, so the circular activity or circular migration kind of suggests that there is some seasonality in the business activities that these people participate in. Is that true?
Yeah. So firstly, yeah. So thanks for pointing out that I didn't talk about occupations. I did not, but that's my error. I just missed out on talking that. So let me talk about that. What are these migrants doing? So with seasonal migration, the data is very clear. The National Sample Service sample data. Okay. So about 1/3 are in manufacturing jobs, 1/3 are in construction. So huge part is in construction. And let's say another third, these are just broad percentages to give you a sense, is also in rural farm harvesting operations. Right now, this is short-term seasonal, like literally few months of the year. Right? As I said, the most exploited kind of migrations. Now, so that's the occupational profile. Think of it in terms of low-end manufacturing, farm harvesting operation, and construction. With this semi-permanent worker, it is pretty much, again, I would say about 20% to 30% is manufacturing. So you think of the worker at the Maruti factory in Haryana, for example. Right? Or think of these automotive workers in Tamil Nadu. That is classically the circular semi-permanent migrant worker who's typically not the poorest of poor. This person has some land. Think of the security guard on your campus. Right? In fact, I like to point out the entire urban informal economy, from drivers to plumbers to variety of these urban informal jobs, belong to what is called a semi-permanent migration. Right? And what happened last year in this great walk back is that people of all kinds, short-term seasonal as well as long-term circular, started going back. So when people would ask me, are these the poorest of poor going back, or are Dalits disproportionately affected by this? It is hard to say, because if you look at the security guard industry, you'll be surprised to know that this is not, the caste profile, the class profile is not what you might think in terms of representation. The average security guard, for example, is drawn from the middle strata of a village, has some land and so on. So two completely different migration profiles. In the short-term seasonal, the jobs are more dead-end. The jobs are more exploitative in nature, really low-wage work. In the other thing, think of textile workers in Surat and Tirupur. They are circular, long-term. They're working for 10 months in a year, and 2 months they're going back. That's completely different from going from one place to another every 3 months. So that's how you should see occupational profiles. But construction is no doubt one of the biggest sectors absorbing migrant labor in India, because what's happened with GDP, right? Construction in workforce and GDP has shot up in the last 20 years. So it's a kind of a mainstay of this migrant workforce. There's some estimates, Priya Deshankar had this estimate, migrant workers contribute, more than 10, I forget the exact, more than 10% of India's GDP. You can directly attribute what migrant workers are doing.
That's quite substantial.
It's huge. It's huge.
Yeah. Okay. There are a few questions. I'll just read them out to you, and there are also people who have raised hands. So let's start with the people who have raised hands. So this is Dhanmanjari. So Dhanmanjari, you can ask your question.
Yes. First of all, I'd like to thank Chinmay. It was a very interesting presentation. And hello, Parag also.
Hi.
Yeah. So what I would like to ask is, what Chinmay said was that he, towards the end, you referred to the Todaro model and the Arthur Lewis model. And I think somewhere you were saying that the migrants stay and they go back, and once they're slightly older, and the people who are young, they are the ones who come. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes. Okay. So, so is it a issue of they don't stay or they can't stay actually? Because what I think is that, I mean, if you look at the NSSO 2005 report, there almost 40% of the farmers say that they don't want to be in agriculture and they want to move out of it. So, if they had reasonable wages or if housing was somewhat affordable, they would stay, and the Harris Todaro kind of thing would be seen at least to a certain extent in India. But I think the fact is that they actually can't stay. They can't even bring their wives. And I think they would prefer to have their kids growing up in bigger cities or even smaller cities, because mainly because of the educational facilities and also moving out of the social hierarchy which is there in a village. So um, I would you like to comment on this, that they don't stay or they can't stay?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this,
Because if you compare it with China, then China, I mean, actually, we can't compare India and China, but you didn't mention China, because what happens in China is that only after you get a job, you get a license to move.
yeah. No,
It's
I
a
mean,
organized kind of a thing, where in India, you just start moving towards a big city and then you find a job, and which actually you do find.
yeah. So this thing, the question is, about,
Yeah, there are two issues which I would like you to respond to as of
yeah,
now.
yeah. So the first thing is, about whether they want to stay, can't stay, or what is leading, in a way, what is leading, why is there no, I think your question is, why is it so circular? Why can't it be more permanent? And I think, I commented on that. There are reasons both on the destination and source region. So what you are alluding to is reasons on the destination side: expensive housing, say bad state support, lack of portable social security. So for example, a lot of migrants say, if I move from Bihar to Delhi, I have to enter the black market for ration cards. Why? Because my ration, which is accessible only in Bihar, I don't have access. Forget ration, I don't have access to education, healthcare, many of the basic facilities the minute I move out of my state. So state domicile policies as a barrier to permanent migration is also, counted among the variety of reasons. But I just want to highlight that even if arguably we had great housing and great, variety of things, migration could still be circular, right? So for example, even if the Gulf gave us full citizenship, yes, we'll see more, Keralites, more Biharis settling down in the Gulf.
But sorry, I have to mention that that is international, and I was talking about internal migration mainly.
Yeah, but I'm pointing out it's the same thing. Going to Gulf, I mean, just so one of the whole things about my research is to not talk about international and internal as two different things. It's pretty much the same thing. The Gulf and Kerala is pretty much like how you see Mumbai and Bihar in terms of how intertwined the economies. And there are more flights from Kerala to Gulf than Kerala to many parts of India. But this thing about what I'm trying to emphasize here is, suppose we had fantastic cities. People would come, they had excellent dormitory housing like we have in China, low cost, affordable housing, good foothold to be in the city. What I'm arguing is that it is still quite possible that many people go back. And that is because of source region conditions. So what you're pointing out to is what we like to call as exclusionary cities, which is a destination region factor. Source region factors are linked with land, attachment to land. That is, again, this cultural notion that I will die back home. I will die in my native place. Right? It's a very, very strong psychological notion. What I mentioned about gender norms in the source region, why should women move? And in my book, I go back many centuries, different norms and taboos, even in the Arthashastra, which is 1800 years or so back, clear norms on women's mobility. So there are a variety of taboos and norms attached to who can move in the first place. And this is a very long pedigree in Indian history, right? And so that is why I'm saying it's not just that if we suddenly make our cities great, that suddenly people will start settling in more. Things have to change on both ends. That is the destination and the source region. Let me give you a stark example. When I was doing my fieldwork in the city of Surat, I had one setting, sort of shop floor setting in a textile firm. and you had a particular family coming from Maharashtra. This is northern, what it was Khandesh. This is Adivasi family, man and woman, right? So firstly, it's a very different, it's a family migration. And on that same shop floor, on the similar task, you had a Bihari male migrant worker, right? And the question I asked both of them is, how is it, why is it that in one case, this Khandeshi Adivasi is moving as a family unit permanently because they had invested, they were planning to settle down in Surat, whereas this guy from Bihar always wanted to go back, his wife, everyone back. And they would laugh and smile at each other and say, we don't understand each other's culture. That is, there are cultural differences in who should move. And the joke they said was, this Maharashtrian guy said that, I don't understand how, this guy has a child who's born and he has to go back home to see his child. Whereas for us, our child has to be with us at all times. Right? So there are these completely different notions of who moves, and do you move as a singular unit or do you move as a family unit? That is why I'm saying it's not just the destination region. So even if the Gulf, as I said, is giving us citizenship, many of us will still want to come back. So there's different factors at work as well. Okay. The other point on China is just that, what you're mentioning about this license or the hukou system, many more people, there's the official hukou and then there's the unofficial hukou. So they have a massive black market, which has actually facilitated, and they kind of regularized all these migrants. So there's one thing in theory, and there's a huge migration happening in practice.
Okay. All right. So let me move to the next question, trying to accommodate as many people as possible. Let me take one question from the Q&A. Trishita asks, do you think we need more migration or we need more tier 2 cities, satellite cities, towns with good infrastructure to help absorb the agri workers into other occupations?
Yeah, this is a classic question of urban economics. Obviously, in a completely utopian world, you'd have every district would have a neat urban center, and nobody would have to move out of your district and so on. Now, that's impossible. Everywhere in the world, there's some economies of agglomeration, which is why some cities will be larger than other cities and so on. My sense is that every state of India should have at least one large city. That's the way I see it, right? Because our operative unit of governance is usually the state. And so the problem in India is that we don't, so you look at UP, Bihar, Chhattisgarh, Jharkhand, they don't have a single large city anymore, right? Now, ideally you won't want, so do I want every district of Bihar to have a vibrant city? Not as much as focusing on Patna in Bihar to become a vibrant city, right? So there are trade-offs to be made. And while this is a classic sort of spatial planning kind of mode, that is, let's have a completely evenly kind of distributed sense of regional development, that doesn't happen in practice, right? So what we should be investing is at least investing in state capitals to absorb a lot of the labor around. But there's no doubt, your first question, do we want more migration in India? Absolutely, but of the better quality kinds. Often migrations start off in pathetic conditions, but migrants do move up over generations, right? And I've documented this in my book in the case of Udupi. You should know that Udupi, despite its mass out migration for over 100 years, is today one of the richest districts of India, right? So the earlier migrations, which are more distress driven, has now transformed into a migration for aspiration and a variety of things. And so that is the kind of transformation we want to see. We don't want people to work in the same jobs generation after generation. So we want more migration, but we also want upward mobility through that migration.
Okay. Makes sense. So Sabyasachi has raised his hand, so I'm going to give him a chance. Hi, Sabyasachi.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yeah. Hi, Chinmay. So a fantastic presentation, and actually, you've already answered a couple of issues that I had in mind. I'll just repeat the question, though I know you've already answered it. The issue is that from what you described, migration is a very long-term phenomenon in India. And I'm wondering whether, and you are also saying that you think that more migration is needed, not less. And I'm wondering whether there is significant proof that over time, over generations, migration is actually enabling, as you said, enabling movement upward for families, or is it given all the kinds of costs, etc., Are they staying caught in a kind of poverty trap where they'll always remain migrants? Is there a movement from migrant family to becoming non-migrants in a significant way?
Yeah,
Thanks.
so the evidence on out-migration and prosperity, however, this thing is actually very strong in India. In the sense, even if you look at UP, Bihar, studies which control for self-selection and all these biases, households which have out-migrants are doing much better than households with no out-migrants. Right? So that's a given. Controlling for X, Y, Z factors. Basically, this migration connection really helps households. I think there's a good, strong literature on that in India. But precisely because it's happening for so long, the obvious question is, if migration was so good, then Bihar has had having this migration for more than 100 years, and there's still a long way to go for Bihar. But I would say that migration has been happening for a long time in Udupi as well, and it has transformed. So in my book, I kind of point out, I have these 4 classic case studies, Ratnagiri, Udupi on one side, and then Saran district in Bihar and Ganjam. And Udupi has done the best, Ratnagiri second, Ganjam third, and Saran the fourth. So obviously the story is not just that if people start moving out in large numbers, things will improve dramatically. It's about what those migrants do, how they're investing the money. So in Udupi's case, a lot of those migrants sat in night schools in Bombay. They invested heavily in education so that every generation which came to Bombay had sort of a higher human capital to work. So that's one observation, that is investment in education by the migrants themselves. The other is, of course, governance. So overall, Bihar's governance structure arguably have been much weaker than what Karnataka had to offer to Udupi, and that sort of seems to matter. So the broader thing is, how are remittances used? Is this remittance used for some good investment, which is leading to creation of assets, or is it just being frittered away? That's one way to see it. The other thing is on gender. People say if migration is happening for so long, surely women, if men are away, then women get more autonomy back home, and so there'll be a fundamental transformation in gender relations. The evidence is very weak on that. So what's happening, you see, even in Bihar, is that still the decisions are being made by the in-laws or by different people. And so the literature on out-migration impact on women left behind is very mixed. And there's one paper by Sonali Desai, which basically shows if the woman is in a nuclear household, then she benefits, which means she starts making decisions, in going to the marketplace and so on, which means if her husband is outside and she's the only person in the house. But if she's staying with her in-laws and so on, then nothing much has changed. But this another question is, when will these migrations end? Right? So, in Bihar, for example, if you're saying it's going on for more than 100 years, when will it end? The answer to that lies in the demographic transition, because if density is a huge part of the story, then as the density, the sort of, the pressure of that density weakens, basically what we're saying is lower fertility. And so that pressure you're seeing now tapering off in Kerala, for example. So Kerala is really at the fag end of its demographic transition, fertility rates are crashing. And so there's kind of less pressure on the land every additional year. And you're seeing migration rates now for the first time kind of dipping in Kerala. But of course, Bihar and UP are, at least decades away from that kind of decline. But arguably, in our lifetimes, at least, you will continue to see mass out migration from Bihar and UP, at least till the 2060s and 70s.
Right. Thanks.
Parag, I'll just go through some of these questions. So Manas asked this question on famines in the late 19th century and interact with epidemics. It's a good question. Yes, famines obviously led people to move out to search for water and food. Unfortunately, because of that, they congregated in large centers, and so you had a good correlation between cholera outbreaks and famine relief centers. Right? So that's one connection again between pandemics and migration. But in South India, see, it's not just famine. Every famine, even the Arthashastra notes famines, and there's a recommendation in Arthashastra that if there's a famine, migrate. Right? But obviously, people move in search. But does that start off a sustained migration corridor? That depends on where they're going and whether they enter into systematic sort of recruitment systems. So there's clear evidence in South India, this great famine which happened in the 1870s pushed out a lot of people at the same time at which labor demand was very high in Sri Lanka, in Malaysia, in Burma, and so on. And that created a particular migration corridor, which sustained for at least 4 decades in last 4 years. Whereas in Central India, which was also ravaged by famines, you never really saw the evolution of strong migration corridors. So it's not just famine, it is famine plus, let's say, the demand side for migrants, which needs to connect so that a sort of migration corridor is worked out. But I tell you, there are parts of India that is famine, climatic variability. In Ganjam, in coastal Orissa, for example, they are battered by super cyclones. Virtually every 10, 15 years, they have this super cyclone. Since I think the first one recorded in the 1860s. So their migration is a very stable livelihood strategy, because out there they know that every 10 or 15 years there's going to be this crazy cyclone which is going to come and destroy everything. So migration is actually a very safe choice. So though we say migration is very volatile, risky, and so on, from the migrants' perspective, often it is safer than some of the other livelihood strategies available back home. So there's a clear connection between famines, or what you can call it climatic variability, and migration. Sarthik has this question: how can we catalyze the migration of Indian women? I think the only real way to do that is through education, and enable that. I think South India has done more of this. So if you look at the textile clusters in South India, they employ many more women. So you look at Tirupur, all of that Tirupur knitting is happening, by women. Whereas in Surat, the power looms industry of Surat is, the workforce is mostly men. So ideally, I mean, if you want a policy decision, maybe you want to have sort of, SEZs, which are completely run by women or something like that. That would be a radical sort of policy decision. But otherwise, it is just, over time, some sort of change in gender norms, which will do that.
Chinmay, there's Yamini who wants to ask a question. So,
sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
Hi, Yamini.
Hi, good evening. Thanks for the talk. First of all, it was very informative. So I would like to know if you could elaborate. This is a slightly region-specific question. So of course, if you don't want to go into it, it's fine. But so the distress outmigration that happened when the lockdown was announced without any notice and railways were shut down during the COVID 2020 pandemics. For example, in Delhi, the situation was very, very bad. And Delhi is a city that is greatly serviced by migrant labor, actually, especially given the level of infrastructure in Delhi and other regions in the NCR. So could you elaborate a little on the historical antecedents for this that led to this kind of influx of migrants in Delhi in the first place? Like, were there is there something particular about the nature of an urban city like Delhi? And also, what leads to this kind of deep precarity of this class of people, who are
So, I'll just point out. So I have a working paper called Urbanization, Demographic Transition, and the Growth of Cities in India from 1870 to 2020. So that tells you a bit about many cities of India and how they've evolved. But Delhi, the big event, for Delhi is partition. By 1950s, something like 40 or 50% of the population of the entire cities was partition refugees. So that is a one-time big shock which Delhi received. If you look at Delhi's urban history, that's when Delhi becomes this really big city in the 1950s. But then it's, Delhi, if you see, I mean, in this paper, I show, why are some cities growing faster than others? State capitals, because of this whole political economy that you need to be connected with the government, especially in the 70s and 80s, meant that these state capitals became important centers. And Delhi being the national capital, even more so. And so Delhi's growth story is very strong, after that. So I would say three phases of Delhi's history. One is 1911, it gets the tag of being the British Empire's capital, right? So it moves, the British Empire moves the capital of India from Calcutta to Delhi. So that's phase number one. So a lot of building works happen. Then phase two is partition. That's the next big shock. And then phase three is this whole, I would say, movement from Bihar and UP to Punjab, firstly in the farms, and then again building a lot of stuff in Delhi. There's another phase of bureaucracy. A lot of that comes from Uttarakhand. So you have a lot of workers from Uttarakhand coming to Delhi, which work in urban informal sector jobs. And of course, today, now you have this, if you look at Delhi in its wider spectrum, Gurgaon, Noida, and so on, you also have the IT crowd. So you have people moving from other cities of India to Delhi. I should note, in India, believe it or not, census 2011 showed, if you believe the census data, there were as many rural to urban migrants in India as urban to urban migrants. Right? It's a phenomenal statistic. It is the first census to show this, because always rural to urban was much more than urban to urban. What it shows is there's so much circulation happening between cities, right? People going from Delhi to Bangalore, Bangalore to Delhi, and vice versa. So that's also an important part of city growth. That is not people coming from rural areas, but people come from urban areas. In fact, the difference between Delhi, Surat, and Mumbai, if you remember, during the lockdown, the three worst affected cities, I would say, was Delhi, Surat, and Mumbai. Why? Because in all these cities, more than half the migrant population comes from rural areas. Whereas if you look at the IT hubs, Bangalore, Chennai, even Hyderabad, more than half the migrants come from other urban areas. Right? So their surviving or holding capacity in cities is much larger. And that is why arguably they had less protests and less sort of problems than what Delhi, Bombay, and Surat had. Surat had huge problems during the lockdown because there's a massive rural workforce which demanded that they should be taken back. There's this question by Nakiran on migration's effect on spread of the pandemic. Unfortunately, we don't have clear data. There's a New York Times article on this. I kind of disagree with that article. Article was very critical, saying that the article was actually called "How the Trains Took the Virus Around India." I mean, there's really no data, okay, on that. So we can make a connection between one or two corridors, like Surat to Ganjam. There's no doubt the cases went up in Ganjam, but overall, I think, luckily, nothing happened. In the sense, you would have seen a big spike otherwise in West Bengal and Bihar, which we did not see. Right now, that's all I can see. So I would be very skeptical that there was actually a major impact of these migrants going and spreading the virus. I should say also that in past crises, it's not just that the railways was on, it took the virus everywhere. In the influenza pandemic of 1918, even in countries where there was no railways, Iran, for example, 10% of the population was knocked out. So diseases can also be so virulent that you don't need the railways to transmit. I mean, if you're just walking, it goes on from one person to another person. I mean, the influenza pandemic of 1918, there were people in remote Alaska who died because of it. So, I mean, so this idea of you need to have a transport system to, transmit a pandemic is, I think, quite flawed. It all depends on how virulent the disease is. It was an important choice to make, whether to go for the shutdown, to send back migrants before or after, right? And in my view, that was a wrong decision. I think they should have sent back migrants before, because the infection rates at that point were minuscule. And what happened then were these big camps, these refugee camps kind of a thing, where you got more density, the classic conditions for the virus to actually spread. So that was completely counterproductive. There's a thing about social security, the last question on, as I said, social security in India has been typically tied to the place of birth. So that is why this whole one nation, one ration is, I mean, the question is, can you elaborate on the historical lack of welfare, which creates precarity? I think precarity on multiple dimensions. I think the biggest precarity in terms of housing. Now, there's no clear social security which can get you with housing. The fundamental problem is we don't have enough adequate low-income housing in India. So that is really a supply side issue. That is, Mumbai has more than, I think, 40 or 50% of its population living in slums. So that's an issue. That's an issue of the housing market, which has really not evolved to absorb this large migrant influx. Whereas China has arguably done that very well. They've got these, city housing stock in cities growing in tandem with the migrant workforce. And then there's a question on internship. Just Google it. It's all online. Just Google. I have a Google site. You can see all the details out there, including all my research papers. So.
All right. So I guess, is there anybody else who wants to ask questions? May have missed. There is one raised hand, I guess. I think Sabyasachi wants to ask another question. Sorry, Deepti. Okay. Hi, Deepti.
Hello, sir. Am I audible to you?
Yeah.
Yes.
I just wanted to ask you, just now mentioned regarding internship, and can you just repeat? And you also said like you were sharing your Instagram handle over here, but you just so I couldn't.
It's all on my website. I have a Google site. Just explore the Google site. All answers are there.
Can you just,
No, I'm not going to answer. You
I
need to
will.
you
Yeah,
need
yeah,
to Google it. You just have to Google.
okay.
yeah, yeah,
Okay,
yeah.
all right, all
There's
right.
It's
something called as
available. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Okay.
Sorry about that. Okay. So I guess uh, this was really very informative talk, and I mean, very insightful talk about this. I personally did not know so many things about how the migration in India works, and certainly uh, it was very interesting to see that the patterns kind of continue over a century, I guess. So it's also like kind of it's going to be there. We are not going to basically see it dissipating anytime soon, and I think it is kind of paramount to have that as one of the major policy questions to be thought about, to be discussed about, and how to make this whole process smooth, right? And
And
I
I
guess
should,
there is,
yeah,
yeah,
I should just add that the policy world on migration has moved tremendously in the last 15 years,
right,
partly because of the work of Priya Deshinkar.
okay,
Before 2005, the general stance was how do we prevent migration?
right,
This has been the fundamental way of looking at migration. That migration is a problem. In fact, I gave this net exam, which I failed. I have no hesitation saying I failed this net exam. But the first question on my net exam was state the problems associated with rural to urban migration. And
oh,
I wrote this lengthy answer as to why it's not. The question was not critically examined, it
right,
was state the problems.
yeah,
And that I think has changed in the last 10 to 15 years to this idea that, how do, as you said, how do we facilitate safe and, good migration or
right.
improving migration? So that has been a big shift in the policy discourse.
Okay. I think that, I mean, I hope that certainly continues. And I think there is also this point about like there are problems that arise at the source of migration as well, right? So, for example, uh, my wife has been involved in one of the projects where uh, they know that both men and women migrate from the family. And then there are kids who are left behind,
Yeah.
and so they have to be schooled and they have to be so there is a good intervention in terms of having residential schools there, so making those kind of things also possible on not only in the destination but also on the source, making migration easier, right? That is also, I think, something which people can look to, I think. And that is something, uh, probably the reason why Udupi, you find better, there might be better public goods available than
Yeah.
in other places.
I should say, there was a working group on migration, internal migration. I was a member of that group
Okay.
instituted by the Ministry of Housing and Poverty Alleviation. This report came out in 2017.
Okay.
Partha Mukhopadhyay of CPR was the head of this. And that report at the appendix actually has precisely what you're saying, an MOU between state governments on how do we deal with education of children who are kind of affected because of migration, right? So there are actually working models between states where often at the destination region, sometimes creches or schools are created in the language of the origin state, right? So
Oh,
that's
that's
one.
very interesting.
So that's the
Okay.
model. The other model is what you're talking, the origin state of the same. But all of this is coming from the experience of people who are working on the ground. That this is inevitable. Earlier the focus was that we need to stop it. Now people are saying if it's happening, how do we make it better? So that's
Right.
that big change of mentality.
I guess that's a very welcome change. Okay. Thanks a lot. I think we do not have any more questions. So,
Parag, can
oh, hi,
I
Taposhik. Yeah, yeah,
ask
yeah, absolutely.
one brief?
Yeah.
Yeah, sorry.
No, no, no.
I have just two brief questions.
Okay, let me.
One is an inquiry. Chinmay, you have shown a graph regarding the death rates,
Yeah.
which ended till the late 30s, early 40s. Do you have an extended version of that, the new to the latest data and post-independence? That's one. If yes, then how does it look? Second question is curiosity, because of my curiosity. I don't know the history. When you are mentioning about the why British did not stop the railways, you mentioned that they realized the panic set in and therefore there is no point. I just wanted to know whether at that point there was an additional economic lockdown imposed. I don't know the history, so if you can say that. And do you think that today or a few months back, if the economic lockdown was not imposed, do you think we would have seen the same kind of migration still, just because there was a panic just related to the disease? Or was there a role of the economy? I mean, why was the migration? Is it only because of the panic due to the? Thank you.
Yeah, no, three good points. First, on the death rates, yeah, we do have good data on death rates. So I've sent a link on this Zoom webinar chat, but since you asked, it's a working paper which literally got released yesterday, which has tons of mortality, very morbid statistics on death rates in India across time. So do have a look at this paper, and it does show you death rate across from 1901 to 2011, across census periods and so on. So that's there in this chart and on this paper which I've shared. The paper's name is Pandemics and Historical Mortality in India, IIM-A working paper 2020-12-3. So that's there. And you can see 1920 is the inflection point. After 1920, India's death rates have steadily reduced every single decade from about 45 deaths per 1,000 people to now it's about 6 or 7 deaths per 1,000 people. So that consistent decline happened. So that is why 1920 is the threshold year after which India's mortality situation improves. This was, the British and economic lockdown. You're right. They were not thinking in terms of lockdown per se. Obviously, the terminology was not lockdown. It was about, how do we contain the outbreak, right? So that was the riding concern. But in a way, the measures that they did, it was not a national lockdown, but they did kind of clamp down heavily in Western India. This whole surveillance that they did was extreme. And it led famously to an assassination. This Walter Rand was assassinated in Pune and so on. And so this did lead to a lot of exchange. Some historians argue that this was the deepest intervention the British ever did in Indian society, was the measures taken to handle the plague in Western India in 1896-97. And they learned after that not to do that, right? And so they backtracked. And so the next 20 years in their plague manuals, they said, whatever we do, we need to first win the trust of the people. Without that, nothing's going to work. So that's how they changed their own attitudes to pandemic management. The third point I cannot forget, but I think it was addressed before.
It was about if the economic lockdown was not there, would we have seen the same kind of migration today?
Yeah. So if suppose hypothetically we just let it go, two scenarios. One, we had some remarkable way of beating the pandemic, and so there was very little mortality, and so life continued. But we do have a good example, which is the influenza pandemic, which is an example of a pandemic without any lockdown, right? And so that, in my book, 20 million Indians, the world's largest demographic disaster. What you got then was literally trains with dead bodies piled up inside them. So we also in our own history have a situation of no lockdown and a massive demographic crisis. So, I'm on the opinion that obviously some lockdown had to happen, but the way we did it was with very little planning. So that's, where I stand. And that if you did want to go for national lockdown, in my view, at that time, in middle of March, we did have the time to send people back home. And that's why a lot of people, I've written an op-ed in the Hindustan Times on March 26th, arguing for the same. Eventually, the government of India did it, 2 months later. But the panic would have set in, and that is a psychological aspect. And people would have anyway, I think, even without the lockdown, started to go back. But what really pushed them to that edge was the uncertainty of how long it's going to last, and the fact that you don't have income. And so, that was what you're talking about, the lockdown aspect.
Okay, Chinmay, there are two questions still. I hope you're not tired.
No, not at all.
Okay. So Ashwin has asked a question. Since state policy is crucial in managing migration, can you give examples of state policies that have successfully countered precarity caused by the onset of a pandemic?
I think Kerala is one of the states which did reasonably well in handling migrants. So apart from the rhetoric, they started calling them guest workers and all. which is of course a bit problematic because in migration studies, even that's not the best word. The Germans used it for the Turks and Gastarbeiter, and that word had negative connotations later. So maybe not the smartest move from Kerala government, but it was the approach. The Kerala government very quickly said, we'll do what it takes. That was important. This idea that we will do what it takes to help you guys. Now the Kerala had some very interesting elements, and I think it should be enshrined in some sort of policy. They realized very quickly that a couple of things the migrants need in those. How are you going to lock down and keep migrant workers at ease? That was a basic question every state government like Gujarat, Maharashtra, and all had to do, because there are these hundreds of thousands of people. And so what these Kerala government people did, they got a lot of carom boards. Why? Because to spend time in these camps. Another thing they did was get a lot of mobile charging points. Right? They realized that in these camps you need the thing that connects the migrant to the home is the mobile phone. And so as long as you have the mobile phones working, these guys are okay. And the third was food. The route to any prosperity is getting the correct food. So they actually got the migrants' food, that is Bihari or Bengali meals in Kerala, to again, make the migrants happy. So these are, I think, interesting, policy measures. Short term, obviously, you can't have this as a 1-year policy.
Yeah.
But for those few weeks, it is interesting. And I think some of these practices, different states, of course, different states have different ways of managing. But I think some of these things that the Kerala government did are worth actually noting down in policy manuals. Mobile phone, food, and so on. Even in Gujarat, by the end, the Gujarat government had to give concessions and say, okay, we'll get you some food. Odia migrant workers, we'll give you Odia food and so on. So interesting ways of states to engage with migrants.
Right. I think Shatadru wants to ask a question, and I think Shatadru?
Dr. Tumbe, thank you for such an enlightening presentation. So the question I wanted to ask is basically at the beginning of the presentation, you had talked about how there are two cases of gender ratios. One where there are too few women compared to men, and the other case where there are too many women because the men have migrated out. So like when this happens, when there is this disparity of gender ratios, is there a cost that both these states have to bear in their own ways? Like how does these two scenarios of gender ratios affect the economic outcomes in the states where we observe them? Is there at all an economic impact in the first place?
Yes, in the sense the missing men phenomenon is directly related with the idea of a remittance economy. Right? So the missing men, what are these men doing? They're going outside sending back money. So all the missing men districts of India are districts where the remittance to GDP ratio is significant. In Kerala, that number is 30%. Kerala is one of the most remittance dependent regions in the world. Now that has, of course, that's the economic impact. That is, everything is geared around remittance. I have a paper on this called Missing Men, Labor Markets, and so on in the Indian Journal of Labor Economics. And what I show there is that in these remittance economies, the transformation happens from agriculture to non-agriculture, but there's virtually no manufacturing. So this transformation happens into services. And so remittance economies, there are very few remittance economies in the world. Maybe Bangladesh is the only exception, but most remittance economies become service-oriented economies, very little manufacturing happening into that. Right? So that's the economic impact of the missing men districts. The missing women districts are very different. Right? So we're talking of a few districts of India of gender discrimination. That is a story of very low female workforce participation. So it hits the economy at a very different plane. It's not in the form of remittances, it's in the form of a different composition of the workforce. But I just end by saying there are at least a few districts of India which has both missing women and missing men, right? And this happens at two different age cohorts. So if you take Hoshiarpur district in Punjab, at this young age groups, there's missing girls, right? Which means basically gender discrimination and so on. And so if you look at the sex ratios at the 0 to 15 age group, it's more skewed towards men. So missing women or missing girls. And yet Hoshiarpur is a district which is part of the Great Indian Migration Wave, which means if you look at the age group between 20 and 40, suddenly it's the men who are missing because they've gone out to Gulf, Canada, and a variety of other places. Now, so Hoshiarpur is interesting because it's a bit of both. It's got the missing girls phenomenon and the missing men phenomenon. So that's a great district to study. If any of you want to have a good economic question to study, what is the combined effect of missing women and missing men?
Okay. Well, I think this was a great talk, and the question and answers really helped. in improving the understanding surrounding these issues. And you have given a lot of material for us to read as well. So I think overall, I really enjoyed the presentation. Thanks a lot again for agreeing to give this presentation for this talk at Ambedkar University. I look forward to many more books from you on these issues, and hopefully we will meet again for some other talk or some panel discussion in near future. I thank all the student volunteers who have made this event a success, who were crucial and played an important role in publicizing this event. Well, thankfully, we also did not face much difficulty there because Chinmay is your name was a crowd puller, so that helped a lot. So thanks a lot. Thanks a lot again. Thanks a lot towards all the attendees and all the panelists here. So I guess we will end the talk here. I will kind of leave this open if Chinmay, if you still have some energy and you want to answer any questions, but otherwise I declare this event to be over.
Yeah, I'll probably leave now. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Thanks. Yeah.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah.
Bye.
Bye.